Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you again for joining today's Nagarro's Product Leaders series, where we bring together product leaders, authors, and practitioners to share practical lessons on building better products, platforms, and experiences. I think most organizations are asking a similar question these days. How do we move faster with AI without losing focus on what truly creates value? AI is making it easier to generate ideas, build prototypes, and ship quickly. But speed alone does not lead to better products. The real challenge is creating the right conditions for teams to make good decisions, stay aligned with strategy, and continuously deliver meaningful outcomes. At Nagarro, we help companies turn ideas into products, platforms, and services across the globe, driving AI transformation from the ground up. While technology is changing at an unprecedented pace, the fundamentals of building great products and experiences remain remarkably consistent. That's why we are excited to welcome Roman today. Roman is a globally recognized product management expert, author, and advisor who has helped organizations around the world build better products and stronger product practices. Today, he'll share why product operating model matters more than ever in the age of AI. Before we get started, a quick housekeeping note. Please drop your questions in the Q&A throughout the session. We'll leave some time at the end and get to as many questions as we can. Roman, we are delighted to have you with us. I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself and take us to today's session.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Lovely to be here. Let me share the slides that I've prepared. So hopefully you can all see the title slide of my talk, Why the Product Operating Model Matters More Than Ever in the Age of AI. So that's what I'd like to focus on. That's what I'd like to talk about in the next 25 to 30 minutes. And then I'm very much looking forward to move into the interactive part of this session and discuss your specific questions. So please share them as advised. Good. Now, I'm not sure if anybody recognizes this building here. It's a football stadium, a specific football stadium. A football stadium in Munich, the home of the Bayern Munich football club. So one of the successful or big European football clubs, and probably the biggest or most successful club in Germany. Why am I showing a football stadium to you? Is it because of the Football World Cup? And some of you might be excited to watch the first semi-final tonight. Well, tonight European time. I'm based in Europe. I'm based in the UK. So for me, it's tonight. No, that's not quite the reason. This stadium is called the Allianz Arena. And Allianz, as some of you might know, is a big, very successful insurance company. And I believe I was the first person to run a product management workshop, at least for folks from IT, back in 2009. And I remember kicking off this workshop and asking people to tell me about the products they worked on and they were looking after. And that created quite a bit of confusion. People said to me, what do you mean products? We're IT. We don't decide on insurance policies and so forth. We build software and we run projects. So at the time, there was no shared understanding in the organization that a digital asset could and maybe should be seen as a product in its own right. Instead, people were very much driven by feature lists and running projects, largely fairly short, focused projects that would touch different software systems, and then teams would get disbanded and new projects would get started. So a lot of change, a lot of churn, you could say, lots of handoffs, and quite a bit of loss of knowledge. Now, as far as I'm aware of, Allianz has come a long way since then and has moved more towards a product-led way of working, or to put it differently, has implemented a product operating model. What a word, a product operating model. So what does it mean to implement a product operating model move towards a product-focused way of working? Well, one way to characterize it is to look at the old way of developing products and building software, you could say, and the new way. So traditionally, as I've already alluded to, development work is organized in projects, and a project by definition is something temporary. It has a defined start date and, well, at least a desired end date. And a project might last from several weeks to several months. I think the longest projects I've been involved with were close to 2 years. My experience is often projects last much shorter, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months. And so a team is pulled together for that specific project. People work on the effort. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the team is disbanded. And now the idea is, instead of having this project-centric way of working, we identify products. And a product is an asset that creates value for a group of people. So those are users that gain a clear benefit from using the product, and possibly customers. So when I say customers, I always think of external customers, people who pay for using a product. Like, I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint here to share the slides with you, part of the Microsoft 365 suite. And my business is paying for the license or the subscription. So I can use this product here, right? So a product may or may not have customers, but it always has to have users. And at the same time, a product also has to create value for the business. That might be to generate revenue or achieve a profit margin. It might be to reduce cost, increase productivity, develop the brand. But there has to be a clear positive impact on the business. There has to be a clear benefit for the company. And so it's identifying the products and then organizing around those products, and that gives us more stability, and it focuses more on not just generating output and getting something done, but actually creating value, creating lasting value. And then the next change is moving from focusing on features and requirements to outcomes. So instead of carrying out feature-based planning and using feature-based roadmaps and working with a large and detailed requirement specification, we agree on shared goals, shared outcomes that describe the value that we want to create with our products, the positive impact that we want to make, and use instead, for instance, an outcome-based product roadmap and a backlog that is comparatively short and focused because it is governed by a single product goal or outcome. And then traditionally, my experience is that work is often carried out by specialists in different groups or departments, and then work is handed off, is passed on. Now, that means that the processes are fairly slow. It means that knowledge can get lost. It means that there can be waiting and delays. Now, in the world that we're in, that is becoming increasingly volatile and where more information seems to be available at an ever faster rate, that tends to be difficult. And hence, I think it's a great idea to move towards a team-based way of working, form cross-functional teams, and support and empower them to get to do their job. And as I've already hinted at, when you have specialists doing pieces of work and then handing off their work results, then you use a traditional sequential process or a waterfall-based process. And instead, it's beneficial to move to an integrated, adapted way of working, particularly if you try to create a new product or a new feature. So when there's innovation, when we're trying to do something new, and equally when new information becomes available very frequently, so we can take advantage of that information and use that to make the right decisions or maybe revisit existing decisions. And finally, traditionally, it's often senior stakeholders, management, who decides what features should be implemented, decides on dates. But I think it makes a lot of sense to consider empowering the product people, so to put people in charge of a product, have somebody who acts as a product manager or product owner, and empower that person together with the product team to take full ownership of the product and be able to really progress that product, evolve that product, move it forward, and create the desired value. So moving from left to right is essentially is particularly for larger organization, not a trivial change, but it is, it can be challenging, and hence traditionally this change is managed in the form of a transformation effort. And some of you might be saying, well, what's he talking about? That's all old news. We've done it. We've done the digital transformation. Of course, we've done the agile transformation, but very digital and agile now. And of course, we've done the product transformation, right? I mean, we've got all this stuff. We've got products, we've got product managers, we've got product people, we've got teams. The trouble is, when I reflect on my experiences working with various organizations, various companies in different industries, that most of those organizations, most of those companies, yes, they've gone through some form of product transformation, but unfortunately, at least some of them haven't really executed that transformation well. So what's happened, at least in some cases, is that job roles were renamed, they were rebranded. Project managers are now called product managers, or BAs are called product managers or product owners. We say we've got teams, but when you take a closer look, then little has changed. People haven't been upskilled, people haven't been empowered. Yes, there are teams, but they're just loose collections of individuals. There's limited collaboration going on, and it's essentially still a collection of specialists where everybody does their own bit and then passes on partially finished work. So it's a little bit like putting lipstick on a pig. So we go through some form of transformation, we make some changes, but the changes aren't really deep enough. They don't really affect the system as a whole. They don't really change its structure. They don't really change the norms. They don't really change behaviors. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why is that an issue? What's the problem? We've been coping with some form of product management, even if it's maybe not super great, but we've been coping okay. Well, I think with AI, things do change, and while it might have been acceptable until fairly recently to have a product management setup, have a product operating model that is suboptimal, with AI, there's a real opportunity and a real need to improve this. Why? Well, my experience is that AI really acts as an amplifier. It magnifies the strengths and weaknesses of an organization and of different parts of that organization. That includes how product management is practiced. So if the way product management is practiced, if the product operating model is ineffective, so if you don't have the right product management practices in place, the right structures, workflows, and roles, then just bolting on AI will only give you limited benefits. Yes, it might give you some local optimizations, improvements when product people start using AI tools, but it's not going to give you a big breakthrough benefit. So in some cases, you could say if the system is very ineffective or broken, what you'll get is more waste. And there are two examples I'd like to use to illustrate this. One is product strategy, and the other one is user stories. So if you follow traditional product strategy practices, and product strategy is looked at and is defined and communicated once a year, and if that's maybe done by a senior manager or by the head of product, then in the age of AI, that's not good enough. Markets are much more volatile now. The rate of change is much higher. The technologies change so quickly that we need to now practice adaptive strategizing, where the strategy is no longer set in stone for an extended period of time, but is seen as, to a certain extent, being adaptable and needs to be reviewed and needs to be updated on a regular basis. Equally, there's a real opportunity to empower product teams and product managers to own their products holistically and take care of strategic product decisions if they're being supported properly, to avoid that the head of product or a senior manager becomes a bottleneck and decisions are being slowed down. And then the second example, as I said, is user stories. User stories for me is an interesting one, because when you go back in time, you go back to the early mid 1990s. We go back to the early mid 90s, and you reflect on what was it like to come up with features, pieces of functionality, requirements for a product. Well, the standard opinion, the standard guidance was to do some fairly heavyweight requirements engineering. And so organizations would work with detailed requirement specifications, really thick documents. And then the idea of user stories was a pretty radical at the time, because instead of writing down all this information and then having big reviews and handing it off to development, the idea was to collaborate and to shift from writing down information to a conversation. So a user story, by definition, is just a brief narrative that is complemented with a conversation. But the interesting thing is, what happened over time is that organizations started using user stories. More and more organizations started using user stories, but they kind of used them in the wrong way. They continued their traditional requirements engineering practices, and so user stories became more and more elaborate. They became more and more feature rich, and product managers or product owners would write those user stories and then push the button, and those user stories would get sent off to the engineering, to the development teams. So to a certain extent, it was exactly the opposite of what user stories wanted to achieve. So, instead of a lightweight process, instead of collaboration and co-creation and leveraging the creativity of all the people, it was heavyweight. There was lots of upfront effort, and it was a handoff. Now, of course, when you look at this, you think like, this is crazy, right? Product people spending a lot of time writing those user stories. How can we lighten their workload? Let's use AI and let's auto-generate user stories. Now, there's nothing wrong with auto-generating certain user stories, but using it as a general principle, in my mind, is just plain wrong, because we have a process that is broken. You should not write elaborate user stories. If you need to do that, user stories aren't suitable. So having a suboptimal or broken process and then automating it or partially automating it using AI, I think it just doesn't make any sense. So the chances are, if you do that, that you might be generating more output, but not more value. And the opposite is also true. So my experience suggests that if your product operating model is in a good shape, if you understand why you built a product, why you build it in the first place, and what you'd like to achieve, what specific outcomes you'd like to generate, and if you are able to put the right people, the right structures, and the right processes in place, then you can create more value, real value, faster. And so as building becomes easier and easier, I'm sure you've experienced that, it seems that more and more development teams generate more and more code using AI. In some cases, cost has gone down. Deciding if we should build a product or if we should add a feature, why this is beneficial, and what exactly needs to be built becomes even more important. And so I would argue that having an effective product operating model is a crucial AI enabler. And again, if you miss the opportunity to reflect on how you practice product management and improve it, you won't be able to optimize product management for AI. Now, how can we do this? How can we take a look at our current product management practice, our current product operating model, and how can we improve it? Well, one way to do it is to use a little framework that I've created based on my work, based on the work with my clients. So I like to look at product management. So first of all, holistically, take a holistic look, and then break it down into 4 components: organization, people, processes, and tools, as you can see here. And then analyze and see what are the strengths and weaknesses in those areas. And if you are now thinking about restarting or continuing your product transformation, if maybe you started it a few years back and you made some progress, but if you honestly reflect on the state of product management and your operating a model, then there may be quite a few weaknesses. Then here are some recommendations for you. The first one is, for any major improvements in product management, it's a good idea to secure executive leadership. That means that ultimately the CEO, the person who runs the organization, should sponsor the transformation, and at the same time establish a clear reason for change, a clear vision for change. And that might be to be more competitive and be able to fully leverage AI to create more value faster. And the reason that it's important to have executive leadership change is that often, and it's something you may have experienced already, that often there are some organizational changes that are necessary. So you may want to form a product management group, and you may want to hire a head of product, somebody who runs the product management group and supports the product people, the product managers. Or if you have a head of product, you have a product management group, but the head of product reports to the chief technology officer, to the CTO, and you may want to make the head of the head of product a member of the executive leadership team and ask them to report directly to the CEO. And these kind of changes, they're very difficult to make without the support of the entire executive leadership team, and particularly the CEO. And with any bigger changes, that is also true for product management. My recommendation is to follow a piecemeal approach. So don't be too ambitious and try and achieve too much too quickly, but rather take the time to pilot new ways of working, new product management practices and tools, maybe in one or two parts of the organization, using one or two products. The benefit of that is that not only you reduce the risk of employing practices that ultimately aren't beneficial for the business, but also that you figure out what works best in your context and how to apply specific product management approaches. Yes, there are standard ways of practicing product management. Yes, there are standard approaches, frameworks, templates, and tools that we can use. However, product management is context sensitive. And we always have to look at the product in the organization to decide what specific practices, tools, techniques should be employed, and particularly how we do it. And what you might find if you work for a larger organization is that there is some necessary variation across the organization. That in one part of the business, you might do things slightly differently compared to another part, simply due to the difference in products. You might decide to use somewhat different practices for an internal product, particularly a technical product like an internal software platform that encapsulates infrastructure services and reduces the cognitive load and development time and development costs for the teams building end customer, end user facing apps, compared to, the work that is done by those teams that have responsibility for their revenue generating products. And then finally, depending on your current way of operating and the current norms and behaviors, you may find that there's a culture shift, a culture change, an element that is necessary. So if you work in a very hierarchical organization where senior people are expected to make decisions, moving to a more collaborative, team-based decision-making approach, can be initially a challenge. And so it's important to recognize that. And again, it can be very, very helpful to have executive leadership to see through those changes. When it comes to the people, then not only do we need new roles and skills, but also I think it's important to see if you have product managers, product people, product owners, if you have the right roles in place and if they are filled with the right people. One of the common mistakes I see organizations make is that everybody's a product manager, everybody's a product owner, depending on which term you prefer. Even if people manage or are responsible for part of a product like a major feature, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's helpful. I think it's more beneficial to have specific, clear roles that clearly indicate the responsibility somebody has, and also clearly describe the authority somebody needs, the tasks, the deliverables somebody's typically responsible for, and the skills. So you can come up with appropriate learning and development plans. And there's also some form of understanding of what is the career progression in this organization in product management. And then forming effective product teams, that's another thing that I recommend looking at. So do you have product teams? Are those product teams staffed with the right people, with the right skills? And do they have the right level of empowerment? As mentioned earlier, that I'm a big fan. Well, I didn't say I'm a big fan, but I'm a big fan. I'm an advocate of having product teams and product people who have full stack ownership, who own not only product delivery and product discovery, but also product strategy. And so I've started to talk about three major processes or areas of product management. At least, that's a common way to conceptualize product management work. And when I talk about processes, I don't mean detailed prescriptive instructions that force people to do some very specific detailed tasks. I find those rarely exist, and if they exist, then usually only to satisfy a formal requirement to pass some form of assessment and get some form of certification. I mean, what are sort of common behaviors, common ways of working? What are the main workflows that are being used? And there are three key ones that I'd argue any product really needs. Product strategizing, that's the work, or that involves the work to make the right strategic decisions for a product. So should we build a product in the first place, or should we build a new feature in the first place? Why would that be beneficial? What's the value it creates for the users and customers? What's the value it creates for the business? Who are the users and customers who will be using it? And for commercial revenue generating offerings, how does it differentiate the product? How does it make the product stand out from the competition? And then those decisions allow us to understand what is the desired value that the product should create. They allow us to then identify specific outcomes that we may want to capture on an outcome-based product roadmap, and then to track the value using the right KPIs, the right key performance indicators or metrics. An important aspect that I mentioned earlier, that particularly now in the age of AI, where we have more information available more quickly, but at the same time, we've got some amazing tools available that do a lot of legwork, hard work for us. I find it's attractive, desirable, and recommendable to practice what I like to call continuous strategizing, which means that you do a little bit of strategy work, essentially not necessarily every single day, but essentially at least every week. So that, again, as I said earlier, strategy is not seen as static or fixed. That's looked at once in a blue moon, once every year or so, but it's looked at on a regular basis, frequently. And then product discovery and delivery. Product discovery is about deciding what user experience design is necessary and what features should be built. Product delivery is making the right architecture, technology decisions, and building the actual product. So those are the three core processes that you need to have in place. There's often a lot of room for improvement in discovery, and particularly in the strategy space. I find that very few organizations, very few product teams really have solid, effective strategy practices that they use. So take a look and see if there is something that you can improve. And the same is also true for product portfolio management. Products usually don't exist in isolation. They're part of a portfolio. I mentioned that I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint here to share these slides with you. Part of the Microsoft 365 productivity tool suite. That's a product family, or more generally speaking, a product portfolio. And so it makes a lot of sense to proactively manage product portfolios and have somebody in charge who looks after them, maybe the head of product. But establish, again, a product portfolio management workflow, maybe set a product portfolio strategy and have portfolio goals, portfolio outcomes that then direct the work of the product teams and provide the foundations for helping them make effective decisions, effective strategic and discovery-related decisions for their products. And that gives those teams the necessary freedom and autonomy they need to move fast. And at the same time, it aligns them, it guides them, and avoids the risk that different teams run off in different directions. So, that PowerPoint team takes their product, I don't know, to the left, and the Microsoft team takes their product to the right, and Excel takes their product, I don't know, up or down. That probably wouldn't be so beneficial. So that's one of the aspects product portfolio management helps with. And then the tools, I don't really want to say too much about tools. And frameworks and templates, because as I said earlier, that is always particularly context sensitive, context dependent. But I would encourage you to have an approach in place that allows you to set the right goals, the right outcomes, to move from a feature-centric way of working to an outcome-based way of working. And there are 4 types of outcomes that I found particularly helpful for product people and product teams. And that is a vision, a product vision that describes the ultimate purpose that we'd like to achieve with our product. It's hopefully somewhat motivating and inspiring. User, customer, and business goals that clearly describe the benefits for the users, customers, and the business that the product should generate. And then product goals, or OKRs, those are then quarterly or bi-monthly outcomes that ideally should be measurable and specific, sufficiently detailed, so you can tell if you're meeting them or not, and you may want to capture them on an outcome-based roadmap and use them then to determine what needs to be implemented in terms of functionality and features in, say, a quarter or a 2-month time frame. And for me, the idea between using outcomes, goals for a product, so those product goals and OKRs are very similar. OKRs, objectives and key results. We have an objective. You can look at the objective as an outcome, and the key results are the key deliverables that have to be in place so that the outcome objective is met. And then the second thing I tend to recommend is to make sure you have an overarching strategy approach framework in place to support the product teams and product people to make effective strategic decisions, but also ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, the different teams are aligned and the different strategic decisions are tied together. So there are three types of strategies that I found particularly helpful for product people. That is having a business strategy that communicates how the business, the approach to help the business continue to be successful. Then a portfolio strategy does the same thing for a group of products, for a product portfolio, like Microsoft 365, for example, and then a product strategy. That's the approach to achieve success for an individual product. And the business strategy should inform the portfolio strategy. The portfolio strategy then guides the product strategy or constrains the product strategy, you could say. The product strategy gives you the foundation for then deriving an effective, actionable, hopefully realistic, outcome-based product roadmap. So you don't obviously have to follow my specific recommendations, but again, you should have an approach in place, a framework in place that tells you at which levels are what decisions made and how are they being tied together, how are they being aligned, how do they feed and guide each other. So that was the presentation part. Those were the initial thoughts that I wanted to share with you. What I'd like to do now is move into a more conversational setting and see if there are any questions that you have that I can answer. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I was just going to ask folks, don't forget to add your questions to the Q&A, but I have quite a few questions, Roman. So
Great.
I actually have one which I was thinking about, which, we've seen there's two kinds of aspects, which is some people will understand that the product operating model makes sense. There's others who might argue that the operating model you're describing doesn't make sense because they're comfortable in the way they are operating right now, right? For you, what are the biggest challenges in actually people moving towards this new operating model, right? Or towards a better operating model?
I think the biggest changes really are around, first of all, understanding what the benefit of practicing product management well, what those benefits are, and then securing the necessary management, particularly senior leadership support to make the changes. I've seen a lot of organizations where the introduction of product management or improvements to product management practices were very much a grassroots effort, and that's fine up to a certain extent, but there's only so much an individual employee or a group of people, a team can impact, can influence, can achieve. And to make bigger changes, you need that senior leadership support. And then again, I think it's super important for any kind of bigger change initiative, it doesn't really matter if it's a product transformation or an agile, transformation, yes, or an AI transformation. That's what I wanted to say, AI transformation. It's clear to understand what we're trying to achieve as an organization. What are the benefits that we're aiming for? And I think it was John Kotter who created a change model where creating a sense of urgency, establishing a sense of urgency is a key element. I think if people can't be bothered or people don't understand why they should be bothered to change their behavior, then that's going to be very, very difficult. Another element that comes to mind that I didn't mention, but that's also related to an organizational aspect and a leadership support aspect is incentive systems and also the way initiatives are funded. So if you currently are funded purely on a per project basis, that's something that needs to be changed. And so that's a conversation that then typically involves the chief financial officer and other people within the finance group to see how you can change more to a product funded, a longer term funding approach and move away from those fairly short term project-based funding approaches. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it actually related to what you were mentioning earlier, right? In terms of the individual, and obviously, if an organization decides it's going to move towards that, it's much easier if you've got the leadership, right? But is it hopeless for individuals, right? Because in some cases, an individual might be looking at this and saying, you know what, this sounds great, right? There's two aspects. One, they might want to make the change in terms of, I want to implement this change. In other cases, it's like, they might be looking at it and saying, I can't shift my mind towards thinking this way, right? In either one of those cases, is there something the individual can do? Is there's something you could suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. So try and move back. Oh, all these animated slides. So, if you would like to move here from the left to the right, from the old system to the new system, a great way to get started really is to use outcomes. Start using outcomes. And a simple way to do this is when you have a conversation with stakeholders and decision makers in the organizations. And when people say to you, we need those features delivered, we need those pieces of functionality, we need those enhancements or changes to a product, then kindly but firmly ask them to explain why that is, and help you understand what the benefit is, and help them understand what the benefit is, and if there's a benefit in adding a new feature or enhancing a feature, and try and reach agreement on a shared outcome for the next 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months. The benefit of that is, so the first benefit is understanding why, is that it shifts the conversation from debating individual requirements and pieces of functionality features to understanding what is impact, what is value, why we're doing this. So you move from the what to the why. And then the benefit of agreeing on a shared outcome or goal for a time frame like 6 weeks, 2 months, or 3 months is that you can use that then to have a conversation with different stakeholders. And that can help you, once you've got this agreed outcome or goal, that can then help you select the right requirements, the right features, and it can also help you prioritize them. And so rather than chasing and implementing individual features, you now work towards an overarching shared goal. And that is helpful for teamwork, that is helpful for alignment, that makes it easier to track progress. It also makes it easier to show that you've actually achieved something and that you've actually created the desired value. I mean, if I'm not, it sounds trivial, right? But if I'm not clear, what is the value I want to create? What are the specific outcomes that I want to achieve? Is it about increasing engagement? Is it about reducing churn? Is it about increasing revenue? Is it about reducing costs? What is it? I mean, how can I then show that the features that my product is implemented or is implementing or has implemented in a given period, that effort's been valuable? I can't. So again, you got to go back to basics, or you got to think about, what's the thing you want to achieve? Think about it. What's the end game? And then say like, okay, in order to achieve this, here are the specific features in order to increase engagement or reduce churn or reduce cost. Here are the things that need to be done. Here are the things that need to be delivered.
Yeah, I think that just to follow up on that, maybe this is a question for both of you. In fact, I think as the complexity of the projects and the timelines of the project itself increases a lot more now. I think, let's say, if it's a shorter duration engagement, I think that you have more focused attention when we are moving from strategy to discovery to development. But when teams are working at least on longer term engagements, Roman, I think one of the aspects of, or the challenges, let's say, is really focusing on the overarching outcomes that the teams are trying to drive, but the focus shifts from outcomes to more feature led, and you get caught up in that cycle of feature focused versus the overall what led to this strategy. The strategy is lost and you're caught up in this cycle of feature loops. What are your thoughts? Maybe Roman, you can go first. I think, how can teams, especially the individuals and even the product teams, how do they manage it to actually have an anchor on the strategy and the outcomes so that it's not lost?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question and a very, very important question. And it's a common issue I see, that there is a strategy, but that strategy is not properly communicated, not understood. people sometimes don't know what the strategy is. If they know it, they might not support it, and they might think they know better and do their own thing. And when that's the case, then the whole strategizing effort is essentially waste. You're better off not doing it. As simple as that. And so if you have a strategy, then it's very, very important that you also have an approach in place. So you could say a framework or a system, whichever term resonates with you, how you translate that strategy into detailed tactical delivery related decisions, how you execute it. Now, there are different ways how to do it. That's not what I wanted to show you. But as it happens, I've got a little framework. In fact, I've created a few little frameworks. So I'll just briefly introduce that, and then for some of the people watching, for some of the people listening, that might be helpful. So product strategy for me really communicates how the product will be succeed, and there are 4 key aspects that I think are super helpful to capture in any product strategy. The first one is, who are the product's beneficiaries? Who are the users and customers? Who's in the audience? Who's in the target group? What market segment should the product address? Then what needs will the product address? What specific problem or problems, which tangible benefits will the product help solve or deliver? Or what are the jobs that the product will help the people do? My recommendation is always focus on the main problem, the main benefit, the primary job. And then what are the business goals, that is the desired business benefits that the product should generate? I mentioned earlier revenue, profit margin, cost, productivity, for instance. And finally, and that's particularly important for revenue generating products, what makes the product stand out, what sets it apart from alternatives, what encourages people to choose it instead of another product that may be available. And so it's important to capture those pieces of information. It's important that you ask yourself those questions. And I find that even for products that have been around for quite a while and are doing reasonably well, it's not necessarily always clear to everyone involved in building that product, but also in marketing and selling that product, what that strategy is, and they don't necessarily have shared answers to those questions. So it can be very, very important just to capture those aspects, capture them possibly together as part of a collaborative workshop. And if you're creating a new product, or you're making significant changes to an existing product and you're reworking your strategy, then recognize that you're likely to have uncertainty, assumptions, risks in that strategy, and that you need to surface them, you need to unearth them, and you need to address them. So any strategy should be based on empirical evidence. No strategy is a guarantee. No strategy, will deliver success no matter what. You always have an entrepreneurial risk that you're willing to take, but it should be an informed risk-taking activity. So a strategy shouldn't be a loose bet. If you like the image of a bet, it should be a validated bet. So again, you should have empirical evidence that backs up the statements in your strategy. And then once you have this strategy, then that's a sound foundation for making more specific decisions. And I like to do that by using a product roadmap, using an outcome-based product roadmap that captures the specific benefits that the product should offer over the coming 6, 9, 12 months. Often 12 months is a good time frame for a digital product. And I like to capture those benefits as product outcomes or product goals. And as I said earlier, each of those outcomes or product goals should be about 2 to 3 months big or long. And then a product goal, a product outcome, serves as an input for discovering the right features, the right functionality, the right user experience design, and then guides and structures the product backlog. And so that way your strategic product decisions can be systematically translated into product backlog items, into actual requirements, if you want so. And equally, when there are bigger changes to your product backlog, you have to check if there's an impact to the product roadmap. And if there's a bigger change in your product roadmap, you should explore if you need to adapt your product strategy. So you need to keep those different artifacts in sync. Now, there are a few more things here with this specific stack, the specific framework. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a technology strategy and a technology roadmap. That might, for instance, say this is the approach of the organization to adopt and leverage AI, and these are the specific AI tools and AI vendors that will be used. The portfolio strategy talks about how to maximize the value of a group of products like Microsoft 365. And the business strategy then states the approach to help the overall business, the overall company succeed. Some of you may not need quite such an elaborate stack. Some of you may need a more complex one, depending on the size and nature of the business that you work in. And of course, that's not the only way to do it. But the idea that you have decisions, strategic decisions at different levels, so a layered decision-making approach, and the idea of tying those layers together is a very common one. It's a pretty old one. You find that in other approaches as well, including the flight level approach, management 3.0, and a few other approaches and frameworks. So I'm certainly not the only one or the first person to suggest that. That's just a specific framework that I've come up with. Sorry, that was a very long explanation. In fact, a little bit of more sharing from my perspective.
No, that's really helpful. I think where can folks find out more about these frameworks, Roman?
Yeah, they're all on my website. They're all published on my website in articles. There's also a tools section on my website. So if you either go to my blog or you go to the tools section of our website, you'll find that. The reason, maybe just one more thing to briefly add, even though I've already talked for so long. There's a reason why I like to talk about strategy also in the context of the product operating model and AI, because I find that strategy can be a great lever or a great change agent for improving the product operating model. So when you have an ineffective product operating model, usually what shows up when you look at it very quickly is that the strategy practices aren't quite right. So, there is no strategy, there's no documented strategy, there is no agreed strategy, or the strategy is made by a senior person or by different senior people, or it's only made by the head of product. Product teams aren't really clear about them. There's a gap between high-level strategic decisions and then specific product outcomes or objectives and something like a product roadmap. And there might also be a gap between the product roadmap and the product backlog. So by trying to address those issues, you automatically have to then improve key elements, key aspects of the product operating model, not only in terms of tools and tool setup and frameworks, but also in terms of roles and responsibilities, in terms of skills, in terms of empowerment. And these are key aspects to get right.
Thank you. Yeah, makes sense. Hugo, do you have anything more to add? What are you
I think Roman went into fine detail and covered most of it, right? One of the things that comes up for me, right, is obviously the part around making sure everything's connected. I think that's an important part, right? Because if you don't know what you're doing on the ground that is connected to some kind of strategy and vision or something like that, chances are you're doing it wrong. And I think Matt also brought that up in one of our previous sessions, right? But I think it's also about making sure that people, and OKRs, for example, work as one lever that people use, whereas there's other tools that do the same thing, which is you occasionally remind people how their work connects to that strategy, right? You can't keep bringing it up. It's like you're accountable to moving a metric, which is related to that and everything. But one of the fundamental parts, and I found, and Roman, as you were discussing previously, it's like one of those things that you're going to spotlight as you start going into these conversations often is that metric doesn't exist, or they're measuring the wrong metric, right? And then suddenly it's like a whole different conversation, because you almost have to create that baseline before you can even start creating, how the people are going to measure that impact and how they're going to look at that. And so I think it's something that the sooner you ask that question of how are we measuring success, the better it is, because you need to define that. Sometimes you have to establish the metric, which doesn't exist. Sometimes you don't have the infrastructure to measure that metric, right? Or that kind of stuff. And so you need to figure that out as well. So yeah, that one's an important one for me, because I found many companies actually don't measure these things properly, or they've just put revenue as a top KPI, revenue and EBITDA. And it's like, that's great, but how does everything else ladder up to that? And they don't have a clue, right? It's like, no, we just have to hit revenue. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, and it's, I think at least, from what I'm hearing, really broadly, is like, it's a constant reminder that we also have to just, put these in place so that, as you're building towards a long-term strategy, the strategy is not lost or the outcomes are not lost while you're translating or moving towards that ultimate goals that teams set out to achieve. Perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's always that thing of asking the question of why are we doing this and why is it important, right? Just keep going back to that same question. And it's so simple, but we forget it so quickly, right? It's like, oh, now I'm going to build a great new feature. And it's like, but why? And I think Roman mentioned that as well, right?
I think I'm going to ask a controversial question, which is doing a lot of rounds these days, right? With AI especially, there are at least some conversations that product management is not important anymore because it's more rituals and not as effective as it should be. AI tools are can actually facilitate a lot of that work. Product management is not as important. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it really depends what we mean by product management and ultimately what our notion of product management is. So the product management, how it's practiced in some organization, is so broken that I'd agree. I mean, if you have a product management system, if you have a product operating model that simply is ineffective, where product managers really are technocrats or bureaucrats, and all they do is write requirements and user stories and communicate with engineering teams, then you really have to ask yourself, why the hell are we doing this? And wouldn't it be better if we did without that product management work? Because where's the value? But that was never meant to, product management was never meant to look like this. That's just a very, I don't know, that's just an ineffective way of establishing and implementing it. But product management ultimately is about making the right decisions so that we have value creating assets and we optimize those value creating assets, or to put it differently, that the assets that we have within the organization generate as much value as possible. That's the actual job of product management. And so that job isn't going away, and it isn't going away because of AI. If anything, it's becoming more important because we can build more stuff, we can generate more output faster, and in some cases cheaper, right? And so I'd even argue that, I mean, as I tried to do earlier, if we're now building and building and building, and we're building more and we're building faster, but we don't really understand why we're doing it. And going back to Hugo's thought, why we're doing it, what the benefit is, what success means, and how we're going to measure success. We're generating lots of output, we're still incurring cost. Where's the value? And so for me, product management, proper, effective product management is more important now than ever. And as I tried to say, I think with AI, organizations finding it increasingly hard to get away with a half-assed way of practicing product management, or sort of that lipstick on a pig type product management. I think it's showing up more now when product management is poorly practiced. There's some other facets in that conversation that I think are a little bit less easy to kind of determine at this stage. So the question of how will the role of product managers exactly evolve in the future, and will we have product creators, product builders more, or is that just a temporary or limited way the product role is evolving or has evolved? And I think with some of those questions, quite honestly, nobody knows. We'll just have to wait and see how things work out.
For sure. Makes a lot of sense. And I think, just going back to what you were saying, Roman, I think as the role evolves, of course, there are aspects that are going to change, but I think, fundamentally what is becoming also a lot more important is, taking the time for you to just, work on these fundamentals more, now that, building is much more cheaper, faster, and better. I think that makes a lot of sense. Hugo, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's what you had earlier as well when you were presenting, right? Which was the hold on a sec. I had a train of thought and I just lost it for a second there. But it's the thing around with AI, we're accelerating and spotlighting suddenly everything, right? Which suddenly everything becomes glaring how terrible some of the places are working incorrectly, or we don't have the right practices, or we don't have the right systems in place, or again, like you say, I think Marty Kagan uses that, which is, product theater. And I think a lot of organizations are doing product theater, right? Which is, it's great, it seems incredible, but when you look at what they're actually doing, you might have a handful of people in the organization that are building the real value, the real impact, and everything like that, right? And it's not just about volume of people, it's not just about quantities, it's not just about having the squads or packs. We're spotlighting that, and I think you pointed that out really, really well.
Yeah, thank you. And just maybe to elaborate on what you said, the problem for individual product people, for the contributors, for the product managers, is when the product operating model is ineffective, that their work becomes really hard and really challenging, and there is a real impact on people and people's health in some cases. And you get stuff done through hero efforts, but hero efforts aren't sustainable, and they're not healthy from an individual perspective, but they're also ultimately not desirable from an organizational perspective. They don't scale, they don't last. And so, I think it's in the best interest of organizations really to reflect on how are decisions made that relate to value creating activities, and support those people who then, are asked to help make those decisions and help execute and implement them.
Yeah, I have one final question, and it's related to product operating model. There's also the challenge that's being floated out there, which is product operating model concept is great, but a business leader, for example, a CEO or whatever, they don't want to hear about a product operating model, right? So how do you approach it? How do you sell it to an organization where the top level leadership doesn't want to hear about a product operating model, right? They want to say, are you building the product the right? Are you delivering what I need for my customers and making me money, right? I just would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think how you answer it, the approach you choose, will have to depend very much on the context. So, there's one way to look at this is to say, well, if the chief executive officer, the CEO, doesn't really want to hear about product and product operating model, that is an issue itself, and that needs to be addressed, because ultimately the CEO and the executive leadership team, they need to understand why product management is important, to the organization, and how product management can help the organization create more value. And so as long as there's resistance, as long as people say, like, I don't want to be bothered with this, you'll struggle to really implement an effective product operating model. And so that would be my preferred answer, my preferred approach. But then you could also argue that, well, that's fair enough. If people find it hard to talk about product management and product operating model, use terms and frame the conversation in a way that is beneficial, that helps people, and that helps people understand what we're trying to achieve, and that secures sufficient support and alignment. And then it might be to shift it more towards conversation about specific value creation. And if there's a lot of focus on revenue generation, or there's a lot of focus on cost reduction or achieving certain profit margins, then bring it back to those goals, to those targets, to those outcomes, and communicate how making product management improvements can help with that. But as I said, at least in the longer term, I think the executive leadership team should be bothered about product management. And if it's called product management function, if it's called product management practice, if it's called the product operating model or the product model, personally, I don't care. These are all just terms. These are all just ways to describe, how we manage products and how we try and create value with assets. And yeah, pick the terms and pick the approach that works best in your organization. But don't shy away from having some of those difficult conversations to really be able to, as I said, implement an effective approach in the longer term.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
We're on time, right? So
Yeah, with that, I think that's a good closing note as well, Roman. Not intended, but I think that we closed out really well. And thank you so much again for your time. We really appreciate it. And are there any last words that you want to share, or your contact information before folks head out?
Yeah, thanks. No, it was great to be with you. I hope what I had to say has been a little bit helpful. So if you'd like to learn more about my work, head to my website, romanpichler.com, or check out my LinkedIn profile. Happy to connect. And yeah, good luck with everything. Product management is not easy. It's not easy because it's a multifaceted profession. There's lots to learn, but also, organizations aren't perfect, and the product operating model hardly ever is. So yeah, it just takes a little bit of patience and perseverance. And no organization is perfect, and no product operating model implementation is perfect. At the end, we're all just humans.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great week,
My
everyone.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.